Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Rav, as always, for giving up time to answer our questions. Before we begin, just a reminder: those who are interested in getting involved in Machon Shilo on a local level, I'm going to post a link to a little questionnaire, a short questionnaire to fill in, and it's also available in the video description for this YouTube video. I'm going to go straight to the first question. We don't have a theme for this. It's just a potluck theme, I guess. So the first question is from Binyamin Lenkin in Ramat Bet Shemesh and Yossi M in New Jersey. Can one open up bottles with metal or plastic caps on Shabbat?
Metal and plastic bottle top caps. Hagaon Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was of the opinion that opening up those kinds of metallic or semi-metallic bottle tops, which used to be more common, I think they're less common nowadays, but they still exist, because of the ring at the bottom, which needs to be broken in order to remove the cap. He was of the opinion that that is actually makeh b'fatish in terms of creating the cap, the final act which produces the cap itself. However, most poskim did not accept this claim. Their reasoning was that the bottle top, the cap is there all along, and the ring is simply there to provide evidence to prove that it was not opened by anyone before you, but the bottle top is not being created by that act of untwisting, undoing that bottle top. So most poskim claim it to be mutar, and I think that reasoning is correct. With regards to plastic bottle tops, usually on the kind you have on soft drinks, soda water, and the like. Those kinds of plastic caps are considered by most of those poskim who had an issue with the metal type of cap. Those kinds of plastic caps are considered by even most of the mahmirim in the first case to be mutar with regards to plastic. So there are those who, in order to be mahmir or to not get involved in any kind of mahaloket, they open the bottles before Shabbat. That is definitely possible. But I do not believe it is necessary to do so. I think it is mutar to open both the metal kind and the plastic kind on Shabbat.
Thank you. Binyamin, did you have anything to be clarified on that? No? Okay. And I don't see Yossi on the line. So I think we'll move on to the next question, which is from Gabriel Martindale in Jerusalem. For Friday night, we usually cook a chicken in an oven dish with gravy. After the meal, I usually lift up the chicken and pour the gravy into another container so that when we eat the leftovers, they don't have any congealed gravy on them, and we can use the gravy later in the week for stock. Is there an issue of borer? And if so, does adding a piece of chicken to the container with the gravy solve the issue?
All right. There is, I believe, an issue of borer if one does it in the way described, or at least there are opinions that would see it that way. Therefore, the simple, straightforward, and the solution that is mutar according to everybody is to remove the pieces of chicken from the gravy and not the gravy from the chicken. In other words, the rule of thumb is as follows. If, for example, in this kind of situation, or let's say you have a pot of soup, let's say you have chicken soup and you have pieces of chicken in the soup. If you wish to, if the pieces of chicken or vegetables in the soup are very, very small, in other words, we're talking about things that are broken up during the cooking, so that they are to fish out all the various pieces, the small pieces of meat or vegetable in the soup, you have to actually go fishing for them. That is definitely asur mitzad borer. But if the pieces of the vegetables or the fruit, the meat, if the meat or the vegetables are in large pieces and it's not at all complicated, is you don't have to make it, so there's no effort involved in removing those pieces of chicken from the soup, so you can eat the pieces of chicken later in the week or later in the day and eat the soup separately without those pieces of chicken. If the pieces are large, then there's no issue of borer. So in this case, I would say take remove the pieces of chicken, which I understand are not tiny, not terribly small. Remove the chicken from the gravy, and then you'll have the gravy left in the container, and that's it. You don't have to do anything else. That's fine.
Okay, thank you, Harav. We don't have Gabriel on the line, so I'll move on to the next question, which is from Hugo in Jerusalem. How can a person living by oneself light candles for Shabbat in the summer when all minyanim start at plag hamincha? Can one light before plag?
All right, so the essential question here is, I understand that this person, Hugo, lives in a place where in the summer, all the minyanim are what we call early minyanim, bringing in Shabbat early, which means they daven mincha a little bit before plag hamincha, probably 15 minutes before plag hamincha. And in order to get to that minyan, therefore you have to light your candles before plag hamincha and get to shul. So you'll be lighting, let's say 20 minutes, 25 minutes or more before plag hamincha. So the question is that okay or is it not okay? It is true that the Tosafot in Masechet Barachot Daf Kav Zayin and the Rosh in Perek Daled there of Brachot and others write that when one wishes to bring in Shabbat early, one may light the Shabbat candles early, despite the fact that it says in Masechet Shabbat that one should not light the candles either too late or too early, but that when one is doing so in order to bring in Shabbat early, which is itself considered a mitzvah, lo hosif mi'ahol ala kodesh, it is mutar to light the candles quite early, but they stipulate, the Tosafot and the Rosh, that it be after plag hamincha. And this is what the Tur writes in Siman Resh Samech Gimel. However, the Rif and the Rambam, or actually before I even mentioned the Rif and the Rambam, the connection that the Tosafot make between plag hamincha and lighting candles is not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud explicitly or in the Geonim. And it is a fact that the Rif and the Rambam, on the one hand, bring the halacha that one may daven, recite the tefillah shel arvit shel Shabbat, be'erev Shabbat. In other words, the evening tefillah of Shabbat one may recite when it is still daytime, the sun is still shining on Friday, late Friday afternoon. And and you do not do melacha once you've said the tefillah. Everyone agrees to that. And obviously, therefore, you must light the candles before you daven. But they do not stipulate that it be dafka before plag hamincha. In fact, they do not mention plag hamincha at all. In fact, the Rif and the Rambam do not speak explicitly about the possibility of davening arvith at any time before sunset, before the shki'ah, which is the lechatchila zman, the beginning of the zman of tefilat arvith, as opposed to kriyat shema, where the zman is tzeta kochavim, which is later than sunset. The Rif and the Rambam do not mention the possibility of davening arvith early, before sunset, except for erev Shabbat and Shabbat itself, in order to recite the tefillah of Mosai Shabbat when it's still Shabbat for certain reasons. So this connection between plag hamincha and hadlakat neroth is not at all a certain thing. There's no clear, obvious source for making that connection. And if one wishes to go to a minyan, which is bringing in Shabbat early, and one has to get to that minyan a little bit before plag hamincha to do so, and therefore one has to light one's candles a little bit before plag hamincha, I do not see there being any problem in doing so, because the claim of this connection, this claimed connection, is not at all a sure thing, and this is being done for the purpose of a mitzvah. Is a legitimate and correct thing to do. Lighting candles, on the other hand, is a chova gemura, having nerot shel Shabbat. So I think it's mutar to light the candles before plag hamincha.
Okay, thank you, Harav. I don't think we have Hugo here, so we'll move on to the next question, which is from me. The neighbors next to me on my floor are religious, but the apartments opposite are 1, occupied by not visibly religious people, and 2, unoccupied. Assuming the non-religious neighbor has not been mevatel his reshut.
Allow me to interrupt. Sorry.
Yep.
When you say unoccupied, do you mean to say that fourth apartment on that floor is empty? There's no one lives there?
So actually, when I wrote the question, it was empty. I think someone moved in today, but I don't know if they're religious.
I see. All right. Well, okay. Continue.
Okay. So assuming the non-religious neighbor has not been mevatel his reshut, will making an eruv with our religious neighbors next to us allow us to carry in the corridor between the 2 apartments? And if I get the non-religious neighbors to be mevatel their reshut, would non-religious people on other floors invalidate the eruv on our floor? I.e., can we treat our floor as a hatser?
All right. Very well. I'll answer the second question first. I do think that you can consider your floor as a hatser. Yes. Do non-religious people on other floors invalidate the eruv that you do on your floor? No, I do not think so. Of course, it would be preferable and would be quite easy if everyone was religious, shall we say, or if everyone was mevatel the reshut. It would be quite easy and would be wonderful if you could do an eruv for the entire building, and for the haser below, the bottom, underneath or next to the building. And that may actually be possible. I wish to mention this possibility. It may be possible to speak to the va'ad bayit, if there is such a thing. I imagine there is. I don't know the number of dati people in this building as opposed to the number of not dati people. If it's 1 or 2 people and there's 20 people who are not dati, then I suppose it won't go over very well. But if it's half-half, or it's mixed and there are people like this and people like that, it might be possible to convince the va'ad bayit to draw up some kind of declaration that in order to allow our neighbors who are religious to do an eruv for the whole building, we are mevatel our reshut every of Shabbat, from the beginning of Shabbat to the end of Shabbat, for this purpose. I think that would be sufficient, and I think it might be worth trying that. I'm also curious. I assume there is a rabbanut in Harish. This could also be something, it strikes me, something that could be brought up at the municipal level, at the city level, even. In other words, there could even be a decision, if there's enough, ahawa wa re'uth, if there's enough goodwill between the residents. It could even be something that the local council could do in order to cover the whole, all the city, to get the agreement of people to do this thing called mevatel reshut. People wouldn't really care too much. They would view it as a technicality, which it is to some extent. And that might be a way to solve not just your problem, but the problem of many people. Now, with regards to the first question, if all those things don't work and are not feasible, it strikes me that what you might want to do, if possible, is to create some kind of mehisa in the middle of your floor, between, if what I see from the diagram that you sent, you and the people next to you are on one side, and the others are on the other side. The ones who are not what you write here, not from, and the question mark, So they're on the other side. So I understand there's an elevator and there's a stairs opposite. If you were to make some kind of mehisa, could be a cheap sliding door which can easily be installed, or something of the sort, then you could define your half of the floor as your hasir. You would probably need the agreement of those neighbors, but again, if there's enough goodwill, it might be possible.
So the fact that there's a thin passageway there, doesn't in itself, that and even though it's kind of the shape of a surat petach, because it's there's a ceiling above you, and then there's these two.
I understand. No, I understand better now what you're driving at. Yes, I understand.
There's no lintel as such, but because the horizontal lines there are walls, and then the gap in the middle obviously has a ceiling on top of it.
I see what you're saying now. Yes, I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. Yes, I see what you're saying. Again, if possible, I would recommend in that case to use those corners and the ceiling, but if possible, install some very, very simple sort of framework. So you have, kanem mikan, kanem al gabehen. Something that looks reasonably aesthetic, not ugly, you don't have to disfigure the chatzer, the floor. Something like that. Yes, I think that would be a good solution.
Okay, thank you, Harav. The next question is from this is also from me. I'm going to post this in the chat because it's a little long.
Yes.
Here we go. Okay. So the main street in Harish contains the following things. One, a covered areas on the pavement, sometimes with a barrier. So these are at the far ends of the street, the sides of the street. And they contain shops and are busy with shoppers and other people during the week. And number two, a central tayelet that has a barrier on each side, but is open at each end. It contains a narrow path down the middle and grass and plants on the side. Can the covered areas be considered a reshut hayahid because of the roof? Does it matter that there are residential buildings above them? And is it asur to carry in the tayelet on Shabbat because it is not fully enclosed?
All right. The rule is, first of all, that a covered space, if there is a roof above it, it is not reshut harabim. Im yesh tikra, it's not reshut harabim. In order to be reshut hayahid, you need to have there are certain conditions. If there's a mehisa of asarat tefahim, which is 80 centimeters, and judging by what I see in the photograph, it seems to me you have more than 80 centimeters there. And even if you have a mehisa with the window in the middle and it continues going up, that would also be acceptable. So if you have a mehisa, and you also have a roof in this case, then that could be considered a reshut hayahid. There too, the best solution would be to create some kind of surat petach, if that's possible, and it might be possible because I see that you have metalwork fences and suragim, you have divisions there and what have you. So you could quite easily create can just continue the existing fence. You could just have the shape of the door shape, entrance shaped petah. I don't imagine that would really bother anyone. It's not a complicated thing to execute, and that would definitely make it even more simple to consider it to be a reshut hayachid. It's certainly not reshut harabim. That I can tell you. It's not reshut harabim. I cannot see all the details of it from here, but it's certainly not reshut harabim because it has a tikra, and it also has mehisot. Now, and also one other point, as long as and I see there are also ptachim, there are openings in the mehisot, in those walls. If the ptachim are not the majority of the length, in other words, if there's more wall than opening, then those walls count as walls, as mehisot. If there's more opening than walls, then it doesn't help. I cannot tell from here what it is, but it seems to me, if I understand correctly from the photograph, that there's more wall than there is opening. There are certain openings, but most of it is separated from the street itself by these mehisot, by these walls.
Right. The ones with the barriers, yes, it is majority fenced. But the ones without the barriers are just these kind of arch type things, these pillars, that would be.
So if overall the majority is not wide open, then so you have rov mehisos, you have rov megudar ala parutz, and then you have a mehisa. So at any rate, it's not a reshut harabim. If it's a reshut hayachid, it could be. It looks from here that it might be so. If you can organize a surat hapetah, that would, I think, clinch it.
Okay. Thank you, Harav.
With regards to the tayalit, which is, I understand, the area in the middle of the roadway, so you have the cars driving on both sides. In the middle, you have this sort of promenade or public space, which is, as you write, what's called a tayalit, which means it's obviously intended for people to walk there. In other words, zema kom lehiluch harabim, and that's what a reshut harabim is. And it seems to me you have more than 8 meters there also, I imagine. So that is, I would say, that is definitely reshut harabim.
Okay. Thank you, Harav. The next question is from Ariel Schwartz in Givat Shmuel. How may one prepare dairy bread where the intent is not to finish it in one meal? That is, what is considered a distinct enough form to indicate its dairy status? Would toppings or mix-ins be enough of an indication?
All right. On the one hand, toppings or mix-ins, by which I understand mix-ins means adding certain kinds of seeds or other substances, other types of additives to the bread inside the bread, the mix itself, or as toppings on top of the bread before it's baked. On the one hand, you would think be a sufficient distinction between that and in other words, if everyone knew that in this household, this bread is always, the milchik bread always has toppings on it, and bread that doesn't have a topping is not it's not halavi, that would be sufficient. The thing is, does everybody actually know? Do you have other people in the house? Do you have guests? Or is it sometimes the case that the bread with the topping is milchik and sometimes it's not quite so? So if it's a hard and fast rule in the house that toppings and what he calls here mix-ins, it's always the case that is a milchik bread, then that is sufficient. But if it's not always quite so clear-cut, then some other kind of external sign might be necessary. Perhaps cutting certain lines, shapes, anyhow, as bakers do before they bake the bread. They open the dough in a certain way. They cut it so that it can expand whilst baking. So if you use a certain kind of cut or pattern for one kind of bread, another kind for other breads, that would also be a sufficient indication.
Thank you. Is Ariel on the line? I don't think I see him here. No, we'll move on to the next question, which is from Aharon David in Mexico. Is it permitted to eat meat and fish together?
Well, In the Talmud Bavli, we find the statement that eating meat and fish together is not to be done for reasons of sakanta. It's considered to be unhealthy. I frankly have grave doubts as to whether it's really unhealthy. I very much doubt that anyone, any medical authority today would claim that it is unhealthy. Nevertheless, because this statement does exist, that it is the general minhag practice of all of Am Yisrael not to eat meat and fish together. And by together, I mean mamash together. In other words, to eat them in the same mouthful. That's considered eating them together. If you have one immediately after the other, that's not considered eating them together. And it doesn't. The order does not matter. And it is also not truly required, as some people do, to switch the cutlery in between or to clean off the cutlery. It's not really necessary. That's really not considered eating together. Eating together means mamash eating together, such as grinding up fish and meat together in some kind of risol or pate or something and cooking or frying it together. That would be mamash eating it together. So now there are poskim who did not bring this halacha because it's not really of an halachic nature, but rather of it's a claim with regards to health. And therefore, it's not necessarily something that one has to be concerned about. I can mention also the fact that elsewhere in the Talmud, it discusses the fact that it is unhealthy to eat raw vegetables. Well, today, a great many people will tell you that that's the only healthy way to eat vegetables. And if you cook them, you're losing the nutrients or what have you. I'm not going to go into all of those details and various opinions, but the fact is that certain things that were once considered healthy are considered unhealthy today, and vice versa. And these things are not actually halachic issues. In brief, I definitely recommend not to eat meat and fish together, but one after the other immediately is definitely mutar.
Thank you. Aharon, are you on the line? I don't think so. No. Okay, we'll move to the next one, which is again from Hugo in Jerusalem. What is the Rav's position on Orlah? Can one rely on the Rav when purchasing fruits in Eretz Yisrael, or is supervision required?
The problem here is that there are certain types of fruit. It's not the majority of species of fruit that we buy in the store and the shuk, but there are certain types of fruit where there can be a rov of that particular type of fruit, which is Orlah, and that's a problem. For most fruit, that's not the case, but there are certain kinds that are. And to get into the know, one has to speak to those people who deal with these things and know the facts on the ground. For this reason, now with regards to, as I say, with regards to most fruit, it's clear that the rov is not Orlah. There might be Orlah here and there in the shuk, in the supermarket, but a majority of the produce on the market is not Orlah, which stands to reason, because Orlah is only the first 3 years, whereas the trees last generally much longer than that. But because of the problem I just mentioned, it is a good idea, where possible, to prefer a place where there is hashgaha specifically for that as well, if possible. If that's not possible, then one can rely on the rov, except for those types where there is truly a problem, where some years certain fruits, the majority might even be Orlah, and that is something that one needs to ask from a place like Machon Shilo, etc. They are baki with regards to these species and the seasons when there might be a problem.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Baruch Kogan in Kfar Tapuach. It's quite a long question. So I'm going to start with the beginning, which is a question about mushrooms and Shmitta. Does Shmitta apply to mushrooms?
That which grows not in the soil, but removed from the soil, separate from the soil, Shmitta does not apply to that. So if that's the kind of mushroom we're discussing, it does not apply. But I'm not at all expert about how one grows mushrooms, but I do know there are various ways that one can grow mushrooms. And I believe these are some of the points that he now makes. So let's go on to those points.
Right, I'm going to post this in the chat as well. Okay, so he says there are a couple of ways that I could grow them. One, spreading a layer of compost, putting mushroom culture on it, and covering it in mulch.
Stop.
Number two. Yep. Okay.
Spreading a layer of compost. The trouble is that it is not made clear here on what the compost is sitting. If the compost is directly on the ground, then that's not a solution. That's not a solution. Because there is still yinika, there is still something getting to the mushroom is still getting something from the earth below. Unless the compost is, I don't know, a meter thick, which I very much doubt. So that's definitely not the ideal way to go about it. What's the second option?
The same as above, but laying down a vapor barrier between the topsoil and compost.
I'm not sure what a vapor barrier is, frankly.
So we've got Baruch on the line, so I'm going to leave Baruch to explain.
All right, please.
Yeah. So I miswrote. Instead of vapor barrier, I meant a geofabric. And a geofabric, what it is it's a fabric that allows humidity to pass through it, water to pass through it, but does not allow roots and so on to grow through it.
I see.
So in theory, you could say that if it was wet, then water could come up from the bottom, but in practice, it's unlikely, because the only way that would be a scenario is if it rained somehow somewhere else and then the water came up from the bottom. I mean, it rains everywhere at the same time.
The water cannot come from above and seep through that fabric into the ground.
It does, but there's no unica because it's not coming up from the ground.
And roots cannot grow through it.
Correct. And mushrooms don't have roots anyway, so.
Okay, and it wouldn't be touching the ground.
The fabric?
The mushroom.
The mushroom would not.
Okay, and with regards to the first point, the first option of laying a layer of compost, and what would that compost be lying?
It would be lying on the ground. My question, which was poorly phrased, I guess, is in this case is because mushrooms are not a plant, the Shmitta applies to them.
Because they do not grow in the ground or from the ground, it does not. No, it does not apply to them. Unless there was, despite the compost on top of the ground, there was some clear unika from the ground, which I'm not sure if that exists or does not exist in that situation. I imagine not, but I don't know the facts sufficiently well. If you have this, what do you call it? This biofabric. The second option?
Geofabric, yeah, geotextile.
Okay, so that is a good option. That is a good option because then it is clearly separate from the ground, and it also is not really a plant anyhow. So there that would be a good option. The third option you speak about is inoculating logs with mushroom culture and stacking them on the ground, harvesting mushrooms from when they come in. Again, I would say that that's a good option if you can place that same kind of geofabric, you say it's called?
Yes.
Underneath those logs.
Okay.
That's how I would. I think those would be the best options. Now, as for creating a barrier air gap between the logs and the ground, how would that work?
Just put down a pallet or something, a wooden pallet, and then stack the mushrooms and stack the logs on top of it. So there's actually a 5 centimeter gap.
I see. All right. That's also a good option in that case. If you have a clearly discernible gap, I would say that's a good option also.
Okay.
And then Shemitah will not apply.
Thank you.
And we're discussing here only mushrooms, correct?
Correct.
Right. So with regards to mushrooms, these would be good options. Yes.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Another question from Gabriel Martindale in Jerusalem. What baracha should be said on vegetables grown in a hydroponic container?
A good question. It has been discussed by various poskim. One possible svara is that seeing that is a vegetable that normally grows in the ground, even though in this particular case it was not, one should say the usual baracha, which is Borei Peri Adonai, let's say. The opposite svara is that we're discussing this vegetable, which was grown in water, not on the ground, and not other vegetables, and we don't really care about other vegetables now. We're discussing this one that was grown in a hydroponic, in some hydroponic system. And therefore, shehakol is the correct bracha. I think it's actually difficult to state categorically which of these two svarot is more reasonable. I would say, therefore, to say shehakol misafek, to say shehakol, and after all, the Mishnah states, وَعَلْ كُلَمْ إِمَامَا شَيْخُ يَبِدْ بَرَوْ يَسَّى. So one is always Yitzeh B'Chavah B'Di Avad, and if one has such a safek as in this case, also L'Chatchila, you can say Shakol.
Okay, thank you, Arav. We now have a question from Chaim Ginsberg in New York. Is there a correct way to wrap the tefillin shel yad? Traditionally, the Ashkenaz custom is to wrap towards oneself, whereas the Sfarad custom is to wrap away from oneself. Is either of these more correct, or are they equally acceptable? Also, should I stop there?
Just one thing at a time.
Yep.
There is absolutely no indication in any of the ancient and authoritative sources whether one should wrap towards oneself or away from oneself. And I don't see there any reason to prefer one to the other. I think it's entirely a question of what one is used to. If one is used to doing the one and one doesn't want to change, no reason to change either way. And if one wishes to change for whatever reason, one may do so. It really makes no difference. They're equally acceptable.
The next section was, is there a certain number of wraps around the arm that is required or preferred?
Lefi halacha, there is no specific number of wrappings around the arm. There is no source for any such number in any real halachic source. There are Kabbalistic sources for the number of wrappings around the arm to be 7, but there's again no real halachic basis for that. So the answer basically is whatever number of wrappings works for you, that is perfectly fine.
And then the third section was, are there varying customs? There are varying customs about the wrapping on the hand and around the fingers. Is there a correct way to do this, or are all customs equally valid and acceptable?
Again, there is no indication, there's no discussion in the Talmud, in the Geonim, and even in the Rishonim, how exactly to tie and complete the tying of the resu'ah, of the shariad on the hand. What we find in the Talmud is the statement that the resu'ah should be as long enough to get to the middle finger on the hand. Now the question is, how does it get there? To take the strap directly from one's arm up here, somehow directly down to one's finger, without it being wrapped around the arm in the middle, is not very practicable. It's not going to work. It won't hold. And that is really why we wind it around the arm in the middle. What the Talmud states is that it needs to be on the hand, and you wrap it around the hand or the finger. Now, on this note, I should point out that we should ask ourselves, why does the Talmud state that the Ritzuah has to reach the finger, the middle finger on the hand? Why is that important? To me, it is clear that the reason is so that you see the Ritzuah. I think this is, in general, the essential reason why we have a long Ritzuah, both of the Shariat and the Sharosh. Because really, take the Shariat, why couldn't you just tie some kind of knot on your upper arm and tie it and close it off there? You could have a relatively short Ritzuah, a short strap. You wouldn't need all the rest. Why do you need it wrapped around your arm and around your hand? I think, and the same is true for the Sharosh, the head. Why would it be not sufficient to have the Ritzuah that goes around the head with the Dalad, the Kesher, the knot at the back, and leave it at that? Why do you need to have anything coming down? As mentioned in the Shimush Rabbah, as mentioned in the Rif, this is mentioned in some of the early sources, but you have to ask yourself why. I believe the answer to all of these questions is so that you see the Ritzuot all the time, and therefore you are reminded that you're wearing tefillin, in order not to be Masiah Da'at min tefillin. It's all about Heseh Da'at, in my view. The halakha we know with regards to tefillin is that Asul Heseh Da'at min tefillin. One should not be wearing tefillin, but forget that one is wearing tefillin. And the whole purpose of the tefillin is that you be aware of them. And if one is wearing them for a long time, during the day, shall we say, if you don't see them, you don't feel them, you can quite easily forget for quite some length of time that you're wearing tefillin. But if you have the Ritzuah in plain view on your hand and coming down from the Sharosh, so it's in front of you, you see it, you cannot really miss it. That, I think, is the reason why even though it's not in the case of the Sharosh, for example, it's not mentioned Bichal in the Talmud that you need to have any length, any long Ritzuah coming down from the Kesher of the Sharosh. Nevertheless, we all know that's what we do. As I say, it's mentioned in the Shimush Rabbah, it's mentioned in the Rif. And the reason is that we see the Ritzuot. The Ritzuot are actually, it's enough to touch the Ritzuah. If you touch the Ritzuah, that on your hand or that which comes down from the Sharosh, that's in lieu of touching the actual tefillah itself. In the Gemara, it talks about the Talmidim of the Chachamim in the time of Rav Asher, that they were mashmashim batfilin called sha'an. In other words, they would regularly touch their tefillin. If you have the Ritzuah, it's the same thing. If you touch the Ritzuah, if you are aware, you touch it in some way, you look at it, you are preventing Heseh Hadat. And the whole purpose of tefillin is to focus the mind and to be aware of the tefillin, so it should have the correct impact and influence on you. That is the reason for all these things. Exactly how you wrap it around your arm or around your finger does not matter, as long as it's visible, as long as you see it. And if wrapping it around the hand itself, the palm of the hand, the fingers, is bothersome for various reasons, or it constantly becomes undone, and a person prefers to wrap it around the lower part of his arm, but above the wrist, which he also sees, then that is also acceptable. It's not mamash ma'akev to have it on the finger or the palm of the hand.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Eliyahu Scotchulus and Givat Ze'ev. If one is wearing tefillin at Shkia, say during Torah study, and one continues wearing them and learning into the night, when one finally removes them, is it still appropriate to make the Lishmor Chukav blessing, or is that beracha only meant for during the day when one has removed the tefillin sooner than necessary?
The beracha should be recited if one removes the tefillin when it is still day and knows that one is not going to wear them again until the end of the day. Then one can recite that beracha, even if it's, for argument's sake, at 3 in the afternoon when the sun is setting at 6, but you know you're not going to get a chance to wear them again. So you can make the bracha at 3 in the afternoon. You don't have to wait for the shkia. Second of all, if you take them off at the end of the day, shkiat hama, that's when you make the bracha. If you wear them into the night, yes, you make the bracha when you take them off. So let's say the sun set at 6 and you're wearing them still till 8, and then you remove them. At that point, you make the bracha. The fact that the day ended some time ago doesn't mean that you cannot recite the bracha. There's no such connection or no such rationale. You can make the bracha at night as well.
Thank you. Eliyahu, anything to be clarified?
Thank you for that one. Thank you.
Sure.
Harav, conversely, if you take your tefillin off earlier in the afternoon, thinking that you won't have time to, or thinking you will have time to wear them again, and then you don't, can you then say Lishmor Chukav much later in the evening, or at shkia or whatever, having not worn them for several hours?
There I would say no, do not recite it in that case. What you thought at that time, you thought your intentions were good, you were trying to do the right thing. Things worked out differently. That can happen. Just as the Ritban in Masechet Holin discusses the possibility of a person doing the Tilat Yodayim, thinking he's about to eat bread, and then for whatever reason he didn't eat bread now. It didn't work out. Maybe he thought there was bread in the cupboard, and there wasn't bread in the cupboard, so he cannot eat the bread now. So is the bracha levatala? The Ritva says it's not, because he thought he was doing the right thing based on what he knew at that time. In the same way, you make the bracha when you remove the tefillin. If you removed the tefillin hours ago for whatever reason, and you didn't say the bracha then, you don't say the bracha now. No, nothing to be concerned about.
Thank you. Another question from Gabriel Martindale in Jerusalem. There is an address to angels before entering the bathroom, which appears with variations in both Talmudim and the Rambam. Should we say it?
Yes, I believe we should say it. It is quoted by all the Rishonim. The earliest source, I think, one of the earliest sources that claims that it's not said nowadays, I think, is by Rabbi David Bar-Hayim around that time. So we're talking about the 15th century approximately. The minyan is quoted in both Talmudim. There's a certain difference in the nusach in the two Talmudim. According to the Yerushalmi, it actually ends with a hathima, Baruch atah Hashem el hakavod. But it appears in both Talmudim. It's not just in the Rambam; it's in all the Rishonim, and it's a somewhat strange phenomenon that this statement somehow fell out of vogue, and it's the reasons given are not at all convincing. The Ya'betz and his Sidur, Bet Yaakov, discusses this and essentially rejects the ideas why it should not be said. And I'm definitely in favor of reciting it. I think it's correct. I think there's value to saying it. And if one wants to, I think one can. And this is my practice to say it according to the Nusach in the Yerushalmi. I think there's no valid reason why we should not do so.
Thank you. Next question is from Aharon David in Mexico. What is the correct pronunciation of the Shewa?
Well, Aharon David, you're asking a question which has been debated by the very earliest of Avoth Adikduk, going back well over 1,000 years. You won't go into all of the possible discussions and opinions exactly. What I will say briefly is this, and I believe this to be a brief and correct summation of the facts regarding the Shewa. First of all, the question does not specify we're talking about a Shewa nah or a Shewa na. So I'm not quite sure what was being referred to. Basically, a Shewa nah is the two dots that appear under a letter, but essentially that letter has no vowel attached to it. One example of such a shewa is the word b'shoch b'cha, the chaf in b'shoch b'cha. You don't say b'shoch b'cha, you say b'shoch b'cha. The chaf is pronounced without any additional vowel sound added to it. It's not b'shoch b'cha, which would be a shewa na, shall we say. It's not b'shochi b'cha or b'shoch b'cha. Those are all vowels that you would add to the chaf. The chaf stands alone. It's as if there's no shewa there at all, and that's a good point to mention. And this is something that I discussed recently with Eliyahu with regards to the Parashat Shavua of the triennial cycle. The truth is, according to the Tavrani, the Tiberian system of Nikud, the shewa nah essentially plays no role at all. In other words, what would happen if you simply remove the shewa nah? You didn't put those two dots under the letter. So again, the word b'shoch b'cha. What happens if you don't have anything under the chaf? You should understand that the chaf is pronounced it's slid over, it's pronounced but very quickly without any additional vowel value added to it. So it's b'shoch b'cha. The fact that there are two dots beneath it really doesn't add anything. It's not a vowel. There's no vowel sound there at all. So shewa nah is really a non-vowel. And that's why in the Nikud HaBavli, in the Babylonian system of Nikud, there was no shewa nah. Shewa nah was just not there. So any shewa that you saw was a shewa nah. And then you know immediately that's a shewa nah. So now let us discuss the shewa nah. The truth of the matter is that there is not one pronunciation for the shewa nah, there are several. What I mean to say is this: it depends on where the shewa nah appears. Generally, the correct pronunciation of a shewa nah is like a hasi patah, half a patah. And that is why in some of the ancient manuscripts, the shewa nah is sometimes represented by a hataf patah, such as in the word kom b'miyuth, right? Wa'olech etchem kom b'miyuth. So in some kitvei yad you have a shewa, two dots under the mem, and in others you have a hataf patah. Now, is there a difference? Are they disagreeing as to how you should pronounce the word? No, they're not. These are two different notations to indicate that this is a shewa nah, because a shewa nah generally leans towards a very short hatuf patah sound, a quick swallowed patah sound. That is why it was written down or signified in that way with that notation of a hataf patah. So in some kitvei yad, kom miyuth appears with two dots under the mem. In others, it appears with a patah and two dots. But really, they're trying to tell you the same thing. That this is a shewa nah. So if you know how to pronounce a shewa nah, you know how to say it. So the correct pronunciation of that word is not, as some people might pronounce it, kom miyuth. Israelis tend to pronounce the shewa nah as a segol, essentially, or a there, which is not correct. It's supposed to be pronounced kom miyuth, a quick, short sort of patah. That is the correct pronunciation of the shewa nah in most cases. However, there are exceptions. If you have a word, first of all, like yizbahu, or I'll give you another example, which is actually more familiar to most people. Look at the name of the prophet, Yirmiyahu. How is it written? What do you have under the mem? You have a shwa, right? So it should be pronounced either, as some people think a shewa nah might be pronounced Yirmiyahu or something like that, or if what I just said now is correct, as a hasik patah, it should be Yirmiyahu. But we know that's not how we pronounce it. Everybody pronounces it correctly as Yirmiyahu, as if there is what under the mem? Hirek. That is because the yud following the mem affects the shwa under the mem. In other words, the shwa na, in that case, becomes half a hirek, and therefore it's pronounced correctly by all Jews of all extractions, of all idot. It's pronounced correctly as Yirmiyahu. That's exactly how it should be pronounced, because the yod affects that which came before. The same is true in a word like yizbahu. Most people say yiz. Well, again, many people pronounce the shwa na as a kind of sereh, so they'll say yizbahu. That's not correct, and it's not even yiz, and it's not yizbahu either, because the shurek at the end of the word affects the shwa na immediately before it, and it becomes half a shurek, so it becomes yizbahu, not mamash yizbuhu, but glossed over yizbahu. So it's effect again the shurek at the end of the word following the shwa na affects the pronunciation of the shwa na which comes directly before it. Another example is in a word like Yosef with the waw added to the beginning. So it's you have wa Yosef. And I'm willing to relate to you the following anecdotal story with regards to myself. When I began davening on a regular basis in the Temani Shul in Yerushalayim, right near my home, and I began reading from the Torah on a regular basis, certain things I learned the hard way. The hard way is that you read it the way you think you should read it, even though you think you're pronouncing everything quite correctly, and all of a sudden the entire shul comes down on you like a ton of bricks and says, no, that's not how you say it. So I learned this the hard way with the word. No one taught me this until I learned it the hard way, and which is that you don't say we Yosef and you don't say wa Yosef. It's we Yosef, because the shawana under the waw is affected by the yud that comes immediately following. So it's the only way to pronounce that in a real Temani shul is to say we Yosef, a clearly hirek type sound, we Yosef. If you say we Yosef or wa Yosef or we Yosef, they'll stop you in your tracks. It won't pass muster, because it's just not correct, and their ears cannot deal with such an assault to their ears. They cannot deal with it. And Temanim correctly, and it's essentially only the Temanim who are sensitive to these things nowadays. And even among some of the Temanim, unfortunately, some of them are lax, or becoming more lax because they did not learn from a Mori, they did not hear it correctly in childhood. If you heard these things correctly as a child, then you cannot possibly make a mistake. It's ingrained. So I'll give you an example. You take the pasuk Misamol ledamasek in Sefer Bereshit, right? So most people would read that mismol, right? Mismol ledamasek. That's what it looks like, right? But if you read it mismol ledamasek in a Temani shul, they'll stop you right there and then. You'll have to read it again, because it is misamol. And it's not just misamol, it's misamol. It's a hasik patach, it's misamol adamasek. That's how it has to be pronounced. And that is a shwa na. The shwa na generally is a hasik patach, a quick, short hasik patach, but in certain situations, it is modified because of that which follows. So as I said, yizbuhu, we Yosef, etc. So there are a number of rules with regards to the shawana, and the only people who are familiar with these things nowadays are Temanim and those who have learned from Temanim. Ashkenazim, unfortunately, have no idea, not a clue, and the same is true for the vast majority of Sfaradim also, unfortunately.
Thank you. Harav, do we have time for the last 3 questions?
Well, let's try.
Thank you. This is from Meir Morozov in Jerusalem. Is there a mitzvah for every Jewish male to have self-defense protection and knowledge, which includes weapons and knowledge of fighting? Should we be dependent on a class of people to do our security?
I'm not sure I understand what a class of people refers to. In general, it's a good idea, not necessarily a Jewish idea. It's not a non-Jewish idea either, but it's a good idea for a person to know how to defend themselves. So it is a good idea. Is it a chovah to study martial arts? No. Is there something to be said for it? Yes, I think there definitely is. And seeing that Jews are often targeted by our enemies of all kinds, of all stripes and types all over the world, it makes even more sense for us to know how to handle ourselves. So the general answer is yes, it's a good idea. But is it a mitzvah? I would say it's Isa Tova Kamash Malan. It's a mitzvah.
Thank you. Mayor, anything to be clarified?
No, thank you so much, Rob.
Okay, thank you. Binyamin Lenkin in Ramet Bet Shemesh. Is there an obligation to eat Glatt Kosher?
Are we referring to poultry? Are we referring to beef?
Binyamin, do you have any? Are you able to clarify the question, please?
I was referring to red meat. Yeah, beef, I guess.
Well, briefly, we know there was a mahloketh in ancient times. When I say ancient times, I mean going back something like 1,200 odd years between the Hachamim in Bavel and the Hachamim in Eretz Yisrael. We know this from various sources, that in Bavel, their opinion was that if there's any sirucha on the lung, any lesion at all on the lung of the animal, it's considered taref. Nothing you can do about it. In Eretz Yisrael, that was not their position. They believed that many siruchot can be removed without tearing the lung, and if so, it is kasher. And this is the reason, this is the basis for the Ashkenazi practice, the common practice mentioned by the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch, that this is what our forefathers have always done, even though they could not find any source for this in the Talmud Bavli, which is true. There is no source for it in the Talmud Bavli, which is why the Rashba writes in the Teshuvah, Al tishma le'af adam lehatir davar zeh, because in the Talmud Bavli there is no such statement. But it's clear that in Eretz Yisrael there was such a statement, there was such a practice, there was such a Mesorah. And we don't have Masechet Cholin in the Talmud Yerushalmi, so we can't find such a source. But there obviously was such a practice. Practically speaking, Glatt, which refers to lesions on the lungs generally, is also, in practice, usually associated with greater care in other areas of kashrut as well. So, for that reason alone, I think it is better to eat what's called Glatt Kosher, Glatt Kosher, halak. The truth is, I think almost all the meat, which is produced locally in Israel, is halak, and even more so is this the case in Chutz La'aretz, because if there's a huge shechita going on in somewhere like Uruguay or Argentina, if there's any safek at all about the lung on the animal, they just hand it over to the goyim there and say, you take this one and we'll take the next one. And so they only take the ones where don't, and it doesn't require so much effort and time, and they haven't got time. So they go straight for the one where there's no she'elah, there's no question bichlal, and they carry on and do the next one because there's lots to do. So in general, the answer is, it's true, in ancient times in Eretz Yisrael, there was not a rule that any sirucha on the lung was a problem. And this is reflected in later Ashkenazi practice. So there is a source and a basis for this practice. But in practical terms, it's easy. And it's very often the case that you can almost not find Glatt Kosher meat nowadays in Israel. And I think in many parts of the world that's the case, because there are many people who makpid about this and that. So generally, it's good to go with the Glatt option, yes.
Benjamin, anything to be clarified?
And regarding poultry, chicken, is there a need to buy mehadrin as opposed to regular rabbanut, let's say?
With regards to poultry, I don't think it's necessary to do so. I don't think it's required. Certain things are done in what they call, depending again on the hashgacha, it varies. So I understand from place to place. There are certain things are done which they don't do in the non-mehadrin, but it's also a fact that if you go back 50, 60 years, no one did these things. These are newer hakpadot. So with regards to chicken, it's not necessary. It's not a bad idea, but I don't think it's necessary.
Thank you. Anything else to be clarified, Benjamin?
No, thank you.
Great. And then the final question is also for Benjamin. Is there a bonus in extending Shabbat on Motzei Shabbat? The Rav in a previous Q&A session said that there is no obligation.
There is no obligation beyond a minimal tosefet kodesh alahol. In other words, to be absolutely certain that Shabbat is gone out. There is a concept mentioned in the Talmud of Yeh Helki im those who take out Shabbat a bit later. May I be amongst those who do this? There is something, there is a certain mitzvah in doing so, but that doesn't mean that if you wait half an hour beyond the time when Shabbat is actually out, you get 2 points, and if you wait an hour and a half, you get 5 points. That's not the case. The idea is that you add a little bit of time from Shabbat itself into the beginning of the week, and that there is a mitzvah in doing so. The basis of this mitzvah is zehirut with regards to Shabbat, to be absolutely certain, and until there is no doubt, plus a little bit more time, that is definitely no longer Shabbat. This shows that we are careful and pedantic about when Shabbat ends, and that we're not in any great rush to, as it were, be free of Shabbat. That's something which is meruneh, something which is unseemly, that we should act in a way which indicates that we're dying for Shabbat to be over. But it's not something that the longer you extend the time, the more brownie points you get. That is not correct.
Thank you. Benjamin, anything else to be clarified there?
No, thank you.
Thank you. And just finally, a follow-up question from Baruch that he just posted in the chat. He said, I was told that the rabbanut does not consider cows which had a C-section treifot, while the Badatz does. In the Mishnah Torah, it appears that such an incision in the abdomen makes an animal treif. What is Peshat?
It's clear that in ancient times, when an animal was operated on, if in fact they performed such operations, I don't think they were that common, and if they happened, the animal usually died, I think. But it certainly was not a common thing, and the chances of survival were low, if not almost infinitesimal. But today, and the same is true for women. Most women who underwent a C-section in ancient times, for whatever reason, did not survive. And today we know that that's not the case. So, in essence, I think the more makil position here is the more correct position, simply based on the facts and the statistics. It's clear that the vast majority of these procedures do not end in the death of the cow.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harav. Very, very grateful as always for the time the Rav has given to answer our questions. And we'll leave it there for this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.